Today is October 2nd, which means it is the official start to my challenge to draft, write, edit, and publish a book in 4 months. This week, I'm devoting fully to historical research before getting into any of the character development, the plot, things like that, because understanding the historical context in which my story is set will affect how I establish all the characters, how I develop the plot. The one thing I actually feasibly feel like I have a grasp on that I can actually do pretty well is the historical research. I have a bachelor's degree in history. When I got my bachelor's, obviously I did a lot of primary and secondary source research. So while I definitely think I am not the one to go to for a lot of the stuff that will be coming later in this series, whether it comes from plotting a book, writing a book, editing a book, you can't trust anything I say. But when it comes to historical research, I have a degree in it. So I think I at least know the basics of what I'm doing. So before I jump into this video talking about the kinds of historical research, I'm going to briefly set the context of my book without giving away too many details. So it is a book set in 1888, Korea predominantly. Korea at the time was a kingdom, so it was before the separation between North Korea and South Korea. Korea was known as a hermit nation 10 years before that because no European was allowed into Korea. They were a closed country. And then they had dealings, many unequal treaties with the Western countries, as well as Japan and China, which allowed the Westerners to come to Korea. So Korea is very much a society that has been isolated from the Western world. And this book follows two main characters, and I'm sure I will talk about them more further on, but one is a Western English British lady, and the other one is a Korean Yongbang, and Yongbang means noble. So he is a young noble who is assigned as kind of a magistrate or a detective to solve some crimes that happen. No spoilers yet. So that's the context of the historical research. So then I need to ask myself, well, what kind of historical research do I need to examine here? And the way I always recommend to study history is almost the snowflake method. I'm sure I'll get to that plotting style later on in the next few weeks. But the snowflake method basically says, well, start from a broad sense and then get more detailed as you go. A good example is, just grabbing a book about the Victorian era, going onto Wikipedia and just saying, well, what's the Victorian era? Let's look up the history of Korea, and just getting a very general, broad sense. And then you slowly go more into the details and into the weeds of history. Before I show you a lot of the resources that I'm personally going to be using for historical research, let's first talk about 4 different types of sources. The first one it should be pretty obvious, and that is primary sources of the day. This simply means the writings of the people during that era. The second type of source is secondary source. These are written by, say, modern historians, or even a historian from the 1940s writing about the 1880s. The third one, I guess this might be considered a primary source, but I think it deviates a little bit, and that is novels and fiction of that era. So, for example, if you are writing a book about Victorian London in the 1840s, you might read Charles Dickens because of just his deep understanding for the lifestyles of people in Victorian London, in Victorian England in the 1840s. And so that would be an example of, well, it's not exactly a primary source because it is a fictional work. It's kind of similar. The fourth would be modern novels about that era. So if you are setting a book, murder mystery, for example, in 1890s New York City, you might read The Alienist by Caleb Carr. I love that book. While I wouldn't use those obviously as historical sources, in writing historical fiction specifically, I think it can be nice to be inspired. Without further ado, let's actually jump onto my computer so I can show you some of the resources that I will be using this week. So I think the number one source I will be using is this thing. This is Open Library. This is also used to be be kind of called archive.org. And it is the greatest secret that academia will never let you know about. Anyone can create an account with them. So let's just search Korea. You're going to see some more modern. This one is called Quaint Korea. Actually, I already have this on my want to read list, and it is published in 1895. If it is obviously out of the public domain, you can just automatically read it. Every single page of this book has been scanned and put online. So I can read this entire book, which I would not have access to otherwise. So this will be, I would say, my primary source. And I have some stuff that are like the Victorian era in general. But for the predominantly, I have quite a lot of Korean history. Some of these are also more modern. So for example, this is a more modern Korean history book about Korean art, and it needs to be borrowed. So this one you would borrow temporarily. And I think you can borrow it for an hour or for a week. I think that's the longest that you can borrow it. I also am going to be doing a lot of research on like the Korean language. My preferred method of taking notes is a good old notebook, and then I have my laptop in front of me doing research, and then I will basically transcribe what I think is important from my physical notes into my computer, and that really helps me to remember the notes a lot better because I'm reading it through like 2 or 3 times. So that's what we're going to be doing this week. For the next 5 days, I'm going to be burrowed in research. So let's see some B-roll of me doing research, and then you will see me at the end of the week to kind of sum up my thoughts about, doing this much research in such a short time. Hi guys, I'm back. A quick wrap up of how this week went. It is currently Friday. By the time you are watching this, it will be Saturday, and I have concluded my first week of plotting my book. So this week was all about historical research, and I definitely did a lot of historical research, but I feel like I barely scratched the surface. So I will continue to do historical research probably through every other step of this process, from plotting to writing the book to doing edits. I will be trying to do like a little bit of historical research every single day because I think that is a very important part when it comes to writing historical fiction. I was hoping to spend about 20 hours this week devoting to this task, and in the future weeks I'm hoping to spend 20 hours on this goal. I already work 20 hours at my actual job that pays me, so I figure 20 more hours a week will take it up to a full-time job. Obviously, I'm not paid for this yet. To break it down for you, I'll just go through how many books and how many hours I spent a day doing historical research. On Monday, I researched for 5 hours and I completed 9 books. Some sources take a very long time to read, like you're reading a full book, and other sources you may just skim it really quickly and be done in 15 to 20 minutes. So each source is very specific on you have no idea how much time it will take. On Tuesday, I also studied for 5 hours, and I read the most sources I read all week, and I read 17 sources. On Wednesday, I also researched for 5 hours. However, I only completed 6 books. There were 2 books that took me at least an hour or 2 each. On Thursday, this was my worst day. I only studied for an hour and a half, and I only completed 4 different sources. I blame me taking a 2-hour nap in the afternoon. I was very tired. Today, which is Friday, I only studied for 3 hours, a total of 5 sources, which brings my total to 19 hours this week. So I didn't quite do it, but I can always do like an extra hour in the next, day or two, Saturday or Sunday. So what did I learn from this week? One is that historical research is absolutely exhausting. Just reading through primary sources and trying to work your brain to pick out all the important information and copy that down for you then to use in a book later. It's exhausting. Just because I know this process, because I have a history degree and I've done historical research, doesn't mean that I am any more prepared to take on the task of doing historical research for this book than I will be for the other sections of this process. Next week, we will be diving into character development, and I will be trying to create as interesting characters as possible, because even though this is going to be a murder mystery, I think without interesting characters, even if you have a good mystery, it won't be that good a book. So join me next week for some character development.